Hello, everyone. This is Jacob Penkin coming at you for the first time from my apartment in Washington Heights, Manhattan. This is my first time recording a podcast, so please bear with me if there are some pauses or I slip up on a couple words. That's going to happen regardless, but this is my first time recording in my room. I have half of my room soundproofed, so it's actually very conducive to a recording environment. There's not a lot of sound, and if it is, it kind of deteriorates pretty quickly. And I also have two blackout curtains. I'm going to kind of give you a little rundown of my room, so to speak. For the first time, I'm kind of joined in here by a upright Yamaha digital piano that I love to comp on and play on and kind of incorporate chords and little progressions into beats that I make. The beats that I make are pretty simple. The beat that I have going behind my voice currently is off an Akai XR20 Beat Production Center. It's a $300 little machine that I was gifted by my parents a few years ago, and I started using it. It's very easy to use, easy UI. The pads, it's a 3x4 pad interface, and all the sounds are preloaded, and you can record about 100 patterns on it, and you can save the patterns, you can edit them, kind of come back to them at any time. It has a AV battery source, so you can plug in, DC or AV, I get them mixed up, but you can either plug it into an adapter or bring it on the go if you have some big quadruple A batteries, I think it goes. So kind of what I want to talk about and address and cover in these podcasts really doesn't have a face, doesn't have a direction, doesn't have a label, doesn't have an affiliation necessarily. And you guys are probably wondering, and by you guys I mean my audience, if I ever will have an audience, if whoever is going to listen to this eventually, when I start getting myself out there and everything, why should I listen to this guy, Jacob Penkin, Pankin, a hybrid of Pan and Kin in my last name. It was actually changed from Pianco at Ellis Island when my ancestors came here. But anyway, why should I listen to this guy, this cisgender, white male, 21-year-old Hunter College student that lives in Manhattan? Why should I listen to him? Why should I take any advice that he gives? Why should I listen to any of his opinions? I'll give you a little reason why right now. So I grew up among two very open-minded parents, two parents that come from completely two different walks of life. My father, growing up in Albany, in the Capital District of upstate New York, and my mother growing up in Bratton Rouge, Louisiana, being the Deep South, and both were born in a 3-year succession of each other. And the interesting thing that I always find is that they both met abroad while touring in Germany on I believe it was Sound of Music, and they were touring internationally for the Sound of Music show, which was a Broadway show, and also eventually developed into a motion picture. But what I found interesting is that they come from two totally different walks of life, and they were able to meet on this sort of polyglot of a tour, and were able to travel the world with each other, going to countries like Liechtenstein and Hungary and Switzerland and Sweden, and going to all these amazing Eastern European countries, and didn't have to worry about anything having to do with America really, and didn't have to focus on anything that would sort of ground them in the present. They kind of lived this like crazy fast lifestyle while they were in Europe. They were getting paid a lot of money. They didn't really have to focus on anything. They were able to see a lot of the world and mold a lot of their opinions and mold a lot of their views and make these experiences for themselves and able to kind of create their own little world in the bigger world that they were already in outside of America, which can be a microcosm in itself, even though, the 48 contiguous states are pretty, it's a pretty vast place. And, not hating on America or anything, but I'm no patriot. I believe that there are many great places outside of America's confines, but I just find that very interesting. So anyway, I come from a very open-minded, sort of, I guess you could say liberal if you want to go a little political, but my parents have never been overly political. They've never been overly religious, although both have come from Jewish and Catholic contrasting backgrounds, which I always find is funny. Another funny thing is my parents both did a DNA test, and my dad was a little bit upset because he came up 99% Ashkenazi Jew, which is Eastern European Jew, and he was a little bit upset because 23andMe didn't give him anything more interesting. I laughed at that, and I thought that was pretty funny. But anyway, I come from a very interesting background. Yes, it is white. Yes, it's Caucasian. But my parents were able to give me a lot of interesting perspectives growing up that maybe other parents had seen. Maybe they had gone to other countries briefly, but not to the extent that my parents had traveled and within show business and with that kind of very niche world that they were in. So growing up, I was born in Manhattan. I lived here for about a year and a half, and I grew up in Closter, New Jersey, which is a small suburb right outside of Manhattan, across the George Washington Bridge, actually right across from where I live now. And it was really interesting growing up there because it's an 8,000 person town. Right now it's about 45% Asian. And it still has the rhetoric, it still has the kind of vibe of some place that you would find in the Deep South or in any Midwestern town. It's kind of, we don't want any outsiders, we don't want anything else that isn't what we're doing, and we want a complete homogenous structure in our town. We don't want any variation, and a lot of people that do grow up in Closter stay there, and they don't really delineate from their trajectory. And it's a little bit sad, but my parents, kind of passing on to me this broad perspective of life and things. A lot of that you have to figure out for yourself. It's not all parental. It's a lot of it's environmental, it's experiential, it's other things, it's social. But I had bigger dreams. I had a broader horizon for myself, and I knew that I wasn't going to be able to stay in Closter. So growing up was pretty normal, I would say, until I started taking on sports. I started taking on soccer and baseball in my town, and one thing that I always really, really despised about Closter when I was younger was the dads would always run the sports. They would always run the rec leagues. They would always run the travel leagues, as they called it, as it were. And basically they would divide up the kids after tryouts between A and B teams. And as you can guess, if you were less good, if you were less developed as a player, especially this manifested in baseball, but if you were less developed as a player, you were pretty much sanctioned off to the B team, and you weren't allowed to. There was like this kind of unspoken partition, and you weren't allowed to really practice with the A team. You didn't speak to them, and the kids were quite rude. There was a lot of bullying that occurred, and I didn't get the same coaching as I did from the A-team dads, these elitist dads that were able to run everything. So I started to get really, really angry, and I gained a lot of weight. Not ever too much weight. Not that there should be a comparison, but I gained a lot of weight, and I was somewhat unhappy. I would eat my feelings a good amount of the time. And this was around maybe 9, 10, 11 years old. And I started getting very, very belligerent with my mom, sort of establishing an abusive relationship with her from that point on, getting in these fights. And I think my mom having her mom be abusive towards her, that was just a trickle-down sort of thing. And that was sort of passed on to me a little bit. And, nothing too crazy at that point, but, my mom would hit me or slap me every now and then if I would talk back to her. But I started gaining a little more confidence in the realm of talking back, and I was able to, assert myself a little bit more and start gaining a little bit of an identity, although I was still very much so a follower in the social realm of things. I didn't really have a lot of social mobility at that time. There was, even at 10, 11, and 12, there was very much a popular group in middle school, and, there was a lot of bullying that occurred, and I took the brunt of this. I even went to a guidance counselor, and around this time, the HIB law, harassment, intimidation, and bullying was starting to really snowball and take effect, which is a great thing, and that was starting to take effect around many schools in the country. So bullying was starting to come into the scope and come into view a little bit more, and kids were starting to get much more chastised for it, and there was a lot more consequence for it. So I was able to advocate for myself, and it was never that I didn't have friends or anything, but I definitely internalized and took things personally. I was a sensitive kid, If you want to talk about signs, you want to talk about astrology, Pisces, I'm a water sign. That's one of the many traits of a Pisces, is being very sensitive. And another funny thing is I share the same birthday with my father, so we're both very sensitive people. But I spent a lot of time with my mother around this time, and we didn't really. My dad was always working. He maintained his job. He was at Bombay Dreams, which is a Broadway show. My dad's a sound man, and he maintained that position as a sound mixer and designer on Broadway after the fact of touring with my mother. And he had worked on many shows, done many projects, many load-ins, that sort of thing, and had bounced from show to show. And around this time, he had worked on Bombay Dreams, which wasn't too successful in the box office, but he had moved to a show called Wicked, which was presented at the Gershwin Theater, and that has been going now for about, I believe, 15 years, and he's been on for the 14 out of 15. He's seen the show around 4,000 times. It's absolutely crazy. But I don't mean to get off track once again. But anyway, growing up, I started getting very belligerent with my mother, like I said. Started experimenting with alcohol of the like, and that led to my first arrest, which was when I was 14, and a friend and I, who I will leave unnamed for security purposes, confidentiality purposes, we didn't burglarize, but breaking and entering, I think, is a better term for it. And since then, I've written about this. I wrote a short story about this very night, as a matter of fact. But we broke and entered into my middle school, which is called Tennekill Middle School in Closter, New Jersey. Very old school. You can even see on the architecture on the outside of the building, kind of etched into the brick, there's a separate girls' and boys' side of the school, and you can kind of discern between separate sides, so that was interesting. I guess they kept them, boys and girls, separated. It must have not been a co-ed school at some point. But anyway, we were arrested that night, and then that kind of led to a chain of events of me just kind of, really not caring, kind of throwing my arms up, really being defiant against the police, and that established my hatred for the police, which is both irrational and rational, I think, living in a small town. I think now that I have a different perspective on things and have gotten arrested more times after that, but have also managed to get charges dismissed and gone to a lot of